Before the sun rises, before the village begins to stir, there is a quiet moment where the world feels almost still. No noise, no rush, just the soft breath of a new day waiting to begin. But life here is not easy. Every day follows the same simple path, yet each moment holds a story, often unseen, often forgotten. Tonight, you'll gently step into that life and follow a single day as it slowly unfolds. And as you listen, you may begin to wonder what it truly felt like to live such a quiet and humble life. Hi guys, welcome to Sleeptale Histories, a place where calm stories from the past help you relax and slowly drift into sleep. If you enjoy peaceful history like this, you're warmly invited to subscribe and become part of this quiet journey through time. You can also like or share your thoughts in the comments. It really helps the channel grow in a gentle way. And if you'd like more calming stories, there are many waiting for you here, ready to be explored at your own pace. Thank you for being here, and now let's begin this quiet journey together. There is a moment just before the sun rises, when the whole world is perfectly still. No sound, no movement, just the deep, quiet dark of early morning, holding everything gently in place. This is that moment, and somewhere in the soft hills of medieval England, a small village is sleeping. The village has no grand name. People who live there simply call it the village, a handful of small homes made from dark timber and pale mud walls, thatched roofs, thick and golden, holding the warmth of the night inside. Narrow dirt paths running between the homes like old familiar stories, passed down from one generation to the next. Everything here is simple. Everything here is slow. And that is exactly the point. Inside one of these small homes, at the very edge of the village, a man is beginning to wake. His name is Thomas. Thomas is not a knight. He is not a king. He carries no sword and wears no crown. He is a peasant farmer, a quiet, ordinary man who has lived in this village his entire life. He knows every stone in the path outside his door. He knows which part of the field holds water after rain. He knows the sound of his neighbor's rooster before it even begins to call. Thomas is perhaps 30 years old, though in this time and place, a man of 30 already carries the weight of many more years in his hands and in his eyes. His hands are rough, wide, deeply lined with work, the kind of hands that tell a whole life story without a single word. He opens his eyes slowly. The room around him is dark. The fire and the small stone hearth has burned down low overnight, and only a few soft orange embers remain, breathing gently in the quiet. The air smells of wood smoke, of dried herbs hanging from the low ceiling beams, of the earth itself, damp and cool just beyond the door. Thomas lies still for a moment. He does not rush. In this world, Almost nobody rushes in those first seconds of morning. You simply exist in the warmth of your rough wool blanket, and you listen. And what Thomas hears is almost nothing at all. Just the faint whisper of wind moving through the thatched roof above him. Just the tiny crackling sound of the dying fire. Just the slow, peaceful breathing of his wife, Mara, still deep in sleep beside him. And near the far wall, the soft, small sounds of his 2 children curled together under a single blanket like 2 warm stones beside a river. Thomas watches the low ceiling for a moment. The wooden beams are dark with years of smoke. A small, dried bundle of lavender hangs from a hook near the window, swaying so gently you might almost miss it. He breathes in slowly. Outside, the first birds are beginning. Not loudly, not all at once, just one small bird somewhere in the hedgerow near the field, offering a single quiet note into the dark morning air. Then silence again. Then another note, soft and patient, like a question the morning is asking itself. Slowly, the sky beyond the one small window of the home begins to shift. The deep velvet black of night begins to soften, pulling back like a gentle tide. The first pale edge of gray begins to show at the horizon, far across the open fields. Dawn is coming, but it is not here yet. Thomas sits up slowly. He runs one hand across his face. He reaches forward and carefully places 2 small pieces of wood onto the embers of the fire, and he waits, watching as the orange glow beneath them slowly brightens and a thin curl of pale smoke rises toward the ceiling. The fire takes hold. A small, gentle flame appears, and the room fills with just a little more warmth. He does not know yet what this day will bring. None of them ever do. But something about this particular morning feels different to Thomas. Something in the air, something in the way the birds went quiet again after that first note. Something in the way Mara shifted in her sleep and pulled the blanket tighter without waking. He cannot name it, but he feels it. And as the first pale light of dawn begins to slowly breathe across the fields outside this small, quiet home, Thomas pulls on his rough linen shirt, laces his worn leather boots, and moves quietly toward the door. He pauses there for just a moment. His hand rests on the wooden latch. He listens one more time to the stillness, and then he steps outside. Stay with us, because the morning has only just begun, and the village of Thomas holds more stories in its quiet fields and gentle paths than you could ever imagine. What Thomas finds waiting for him just beyond that door changes the shape of this ordinary day in a way no one in the village could have expected. The door opened slowly, and Thomas stepped out into the morning. The air outside was cool, not cold enough to sting, just cool enough to remind you that you were alive. It moved gently across his face like a soft cloth, clean, quiet, carrying the faint smell of wet grass and distant wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney already beginning to breathe. Thomas stood still for a moment on the narrow dirt path just outside his door. He looked up. The sky above the village was doing something beautiful. The deep blue of the night was slowly fading, pulling back toward the west like a velvet curtain being drawn away, and in its place, from the east, came the very first pale wash of light,
soft gold, soft pink, soft as the inside of a shell found on a riverbank. The clouds near the horizon were still dark at their centers, but their edges were beginning to glow. Thomas watched this happen. He had watched it happen almost every morning of his life, and still it never felt small. He walked slowly toward the small barn at the side of the house. His boots made a gentle sound on the dirt path, a soft, rhythmic pressing of leather into earth. The path was familiar beneath his feet. Every uneven stone, every soft hollow where rainwater sometimes gathered, he knew each one without looking down. Inside the barn, it was warm and dim. 2 brown cows stood quietly in their places, their large dark eyes blinking slowly in the low light. A handful of chickens moved in small circles near the far wall, making their soft, steady murmuring sounds. And in the corner, an old gray donkey stood completely still, with its eyes half closed, as if it had simply decided that morning had not yet fully arrived, and it would wait a little longer before agreeing to wake up. Thomas smiled at that. He moved gently through the barn. He spoke to the animals in a low, quiet voice, not real words, just soft sounds, the kind of sounds that mean, "I am here, everything is calm, there is nothing to worry about." The cows shifted slightly at the sound of his voice. Their breath came out in slow, warm clouds in the cool morning air. He filled their water. He placed fresh hay in the long wooden trough. He moved carefully and without rushing, the way a man moves when he has done the same task so many hundreds of times that his hands simply know what to do without being told. By the time he stepped back outside, the sky had changed again. The pale gold light had spread further now. The horizon was bright and soft, and the fields beyond the village, long open strips of dark earth, were beginning to emerge from the darkness, slowly, the way a drawing appears when someone adds gentle color to it with a careful hand. Mist lay low across the fields, thin and white and peaceful, drifting just above the ground, like something the night had left behind on purpose. Here and there, a taller weed or a fence post rose up through the mist, like a quiet island in a soft white sea. Thomas stood at the edge of the path and looked out over all of it. The village behind him was still mostly asleep. 1 or 2 other homes were beginning to show signs of life. A thin line of smoke rising from a chimney, the distant sound of a door opening and closing softly. But the world still felt mostly still, mostly quiet, mostly his. He heard Mara before he saw her, the soft sound of her moving inside the house, the gentle knock of a wooden bowl being placed on the table, the low creak of the fire being stirred back to life, and then the smell, warm bread or something close to it, the dense round loaves that Mara made from the coarse grain they kept in a sack near the back wall. She would have put them near the fire last night to begin their slow rise, and now, this morning, the smell of them warming in the heat was drifting through the small window and out into the cool air where Thomas stood. It was one of the most peaceful smells in the world. He breathed it in slowly. He let it fill him completely. Inside, Mara moved around the small room with quiet confidence. She was a steady woman, not loud, not dramatic, just deeply, quietly capable in a way that made everything around her feel more settled and more safe. She had already rekindled the fire to a gentle glow. She had already filled the iron pot with water from the wooden bucket near the door and hung it above the flames to warm. She had already set out the rough wooden bowls on the low table. She looked up when Thomas stepped back inside. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. Just a look, soft and familiar, the kind of look that carries years of shared mornings inside it. The kind of look that says, "Good morning, and I am glad you are here, and we have a good life, all at the same time, without a single word being spoken." Thomas sat down slowly at the table. The fire crackled gently beside him. The bread was warm. The morning was calm. And somewhere outside, just at the edge of the village, a sound drifted in through the open window that made Thomas pause with his bowl halfway to his lips. A sound that did not quite belong to this quiet morning. A voice, distant, low, calling someone's name. Stay with us, because the village is waking up now, and not everyone in it is starting their morning the same way Thomas is. Something is stirring at the far edge of the field, something quiet but growing, and in part 3, the morning air carries a message that changes everything about this simple, peaceful day. Keep listening. The story is just beginning to breathe. Thomas set down his bowl. He listened. The sound came again through the open window, low and distant. A voice somewhere out beyond the edge of the village, calling into the pale morning air. He could not make out the words, just the shape of them, rising and falling softly, like the call of a bird that has lost its direction in the mist. Mara looked at him from across the small room. She had heard it too. Neither of them spoke. Thomas simply stood, pulled his rough wool coat from the hook beside the door, and stepped back outside into the cool morning. The door closed gently behind him. The village path was still and soft underfoot. The dirt had been packed down over many years by boots and hooves and the slow turning of wooden cartwheels. It curved gently between the homes, narrow and familiar, edged on both sides by low wooden fences and patches of dark green grass still heavy with the night's dew. Thomas walked slowly. He was not in a hurry. Whatever that voice was, it did not carry panic in it. It carried something else, something quieter, something that felt more like searching than alarm. And so he walked at the pace the morning seemed to want, slow, steady, breathing gently. The village around him was mostly still asleep. Most of the homes he passed were dark and quiet. Their small windows showed no light. Their thatched roofs were silver with morning dew, each strand of straw catching the pale dawn light and holding it like something precious. Thin threads of mist drifted between the homes, moving so slowly they seemed more like memory than weather. But here and there, the village was beginning to stir. From one home, the soft orange flicker of a fire newly started showed through the low window. From another, the sound of a child coughing gently and then going quiet again. A black cat sat perfectly still on top of a low stone wall, watching Thomas pass with large yellow eyes that held no particular opinion about anything. Thomas nodded at the cat. The cat did not nod back. He passed the home of old Edmund, the miller. Edmund was perhaps 60 years old, which in this village made him one of the oldest living people most people had ever known. His home was slightly larger than the others, with a stone chimney that always seemed to be breathing even in the warmest months. The wooden wheel of his small mill sat at the edge of the narrow stream just behind his home, still and quiet now, waiting for the day to begin. Edmund had lived in this village longer than anyone could clearly remember. He knew its rhythms the way a river knows its own banks, not by thinking about them, but simply by being part of them for so long that the two had become one thing.
His door was already open, just slightly, just enough to show a thin line of warm firelight inside. Thomas paused for a moment by the low gate in front of Edmund's home. He looked at that open door. He listened. But from inside came only the soft, steady sound of the old man moving slowly across his floor, the gentle scrape of a chair, the low sound of something being poured from one vessel into another. Thomas moved on. The path curved to the right near the center of the village, opening up into a small open space, not quite a square, not quite a field, just a wide, flat area of bare earth where the paths from different directions all came together. There was a large stone well at the center of this space, old and dark, and covered on one side with a soft coat of pale green moss. Thomas stopped here. He stood beside the well and looked around slowly. From here, he could see almost the whole village at once, the homes in their gentle rows, the bare fields stretching away beyond the wooden fences, the thin ribbon of the stream catching the first real light of morning, shimmering gently between the trees. It was, in this moment, one of the most peaceful places in the world. And standing there, breathing the cool, clean morning air, Thomas felt the quiet of it settle over him like a warm, gentle hand placed on his shoulder. He almost forgot about the voice. And then he heard it again, almost, closer this time, coming from the far side of the open space where a narrow path led between two homes and disappeared into the edge of the field beyond. It was a woman's voice, old, a little rough around the edges, but steady, saying a name, over and over, with the same gentle patience. A name Thomas recognizes. Stay with us. Because that name belongs to someone Thomas knows well, someone who should not be out in the fields alone at this hour, someone whose absence is already beginning to pull at the quiet edges of this peaceful morning. Thomas follows that voice into the field, and what he finds there is something the village has not seen in a long time. Keep listening. The morning is getting lighter, and the story is getting deeper. Thomas followed the voice. He moved through the narrow gap between the two homes and stepped out onto the edge of the field, and the world opened up. After the closeness of the village paths and the low ceilings of the homes, the field felt enormous, wide and flat, and stretching away in all directions under the pale morning sky. The mist was thicker here, lying low across the dark earth in long, gentle drifts. The air smelled of soil and grass, and the faint sweetness of something blooming somewhere far across the field that Thomas could not quite name. He stood at the edge
and breathed it all in slowly. The sky above the field was doing something remarkable. The soft gold of early dawn had deepened now into something warmer. The clouds near the horizon had turned the color of pale copper and rose, and the light, that gentle, shimmering light of a new morning, was just beginning to touch the tops of the furrows in the field, laying itself down across the dark ridges of earth, like something being carefully placed there by a quiet, unhurried hand. It was the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was, the kind of light that made the whole world feel, just for a moment, like a place where nothing difficult could ever happen. The voice came again, to his left, closer now. Thomas turned slowly, and there, at the far edge of the nearest strip of field, he saw her, Agnes. She was perhaps 70 years old, though her age was difficult to measure in the usual way. She was small and thin, with a wide dark shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and a long gray dress that brushed the tops of the furrows as she moved slowly between the rows. Her fingers moved across them slowly and carefully, the way a person reads something in a language they love very much. And she was calling softly, a name, over and over. William, William. Thomas walked toward her gently. He did not rush. He did not call out to her from a distance. He simply moved across the soft earth of the field, slowly, his boots pressing into the damp soil with a quiet rhythmic sound, until he was close enough to speak in a low and careful voice. Agnes, he said softly. She turned. Her face in the morning light was deeply lined with dark, gentle eyes that held a kind of permanent calmness in them, the look of someone who has lived long enough to understand that most things, in the end, find their way back to being all right. She looked at Thomas for a moment. Then she smiled, slowly, warmly. William went out before me, she said simply. He always does. I only came to find him. Thomas looked out across the field. And there, further along the strip of land, moving steadily and without hurry through the thin morning mist, was William, Agnes's husband, a broad, quiet man of perhaps 75, moving along the furrows with a long-handled tool resting across his shoulder, his heavy boots leaving a steady trail of dark prints in the soft earth behind him. He had simply come out to tend the field, as he did every morning, as he had done for more mornings than most people in the village could count. Thomas stood beside Agnes for a moment, and they both watched William move slowly through the mist. There was something deeply peaceful about the sight of him. An old man, a familiar field, a tool worn smooth by decades of use, moving through the soft morning light with the patient, unhurried rhythm of someone who has long since made peace with the idea that the work is never truly finished and that this is perfectly all right. Agnes watched her husband with quiet eyes. He worries about the east end of the field, she said softly, almost to herself. The soil there has been difficult this season. He goes there first every morning to check it. She paused. He has done that for 40 years, she added. Thomas nodded slowly. He understood. He offered to walk with Agnes back toward the village. She accepted without fuss, pulling her shawl a little tighter and turning back toward the narrow path between the homes with small, careful steps. Thomas walked beside her slowly. The field stretched out around them in the growing light. More of the village was awake now. Thomas could hear it in the gentle distance, the sound of a door, the low call of someone to someone else, the rhythmic clank of the well handle being turned. The morning was moving forward, quietly, steadily, the way all good mornings do. But as Thomas and Agnes reached the edge of the field and stepped back onto the village path, Thomas heard something behind him. He turned. William had stopped moving. He was standing completely still at the far end of the field, in the area Agnes had called the east end. His tool rested in the earth beside him. His hands were at his sides. He was looking down at the ground. And even from this distance, across the wide, misty field, Thomas could see that something about the way William was standing had changed. The easy, patient rhythm was gone. His shoulders were stiff, his head was tilted forward, and he was not moving at all. Stay with us, because William has found something in the east end of the field, something in the soil that has stopped him completely still on a morning when nothing was supposed to be different from any other morning. Thomas crosses that field, and what William is standing over is something that neither of them has any simple answer for. Keep listening. The light is growing softer, and the story is growing still.
Thomas crossed the field. His boots pressed into the soft earth with a slow, steady rhythm. The mist had mostly lifted now, pulled upward by the growing warmth of the morning sun, and the field around him was clear and wide and full of gentle light. He walked toward William, and as he got closer, he saw that William was not in distress. He was not hurt. He was not frightened. He was simply standing, looking down at something in the soil with the quiet, focused attention of a man who has seen many things in his long life and learned to look carefully before deciding what to think about any of them. Thomas stopped beside him. He looked down, too. There, in the dark earth of the east end of the field, was a stretch of soil that looked different from everything around it, softer somehow, slightly sunken, as if something beneath it had shifted quietly in the night, leaving the surface above it looking uncertain and unsettled. William crouched down slowly and pressed one wide, rough hand flat against the earth. He held it there for a long moment. Then he stood back up with the patient slowness of a man whose knees have carried him through many decades of mornings exactly like this one. "The water moved beneath here last winter," William said quietly. "I thought it had settled, but the ground is telling me something different this morning." He looked out across the field with calm, steady eyes. "We will need to tend this section carefully," he said, "before the next planting." And that was all. No alarm, no rushing, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet observation from a man who understood the earth the way most people understand the faces of people they have loved for a long time. Thomas nodded slowly. They stood together in the field for another long moment, both of them looking at that small, soft patch of uncertain ground. And then William picked up his tool, rested it back across his shoulder, and began moving again, slowly, steadily, further along the row, as if it were simply the next thing to do, because it was. The morning passed the way good mornings do in a place like this, slowly, fully, with the kind of unhurried completeness that most people, in most times, spend their whole lives looking for
without ever quite finding. Thomas worked his own strip of field through the late morning hours. He moved along the furrows with his long iron-tipped tool, turning the soil carefully, breaking up the harder clumps, checking the young plants that had already begun to push their pale green shoots up through the dark earth with the quiet determination of things that simply want to grow. The sun climbed higher. The light changed from the soft gold of early morning into something fuller and warmer. It lay across the field in long, shimmering sheets, turning the dew on the grass at the edge of the field into tiny, bright points of light that appeared and disappeared as the gentle wind moved through the field. Birds passed overhead in small, loose groups, not rushing, just moving through the warm air with slow, easy wing beats, as if they too had decided that today was a day for taking things gently. When the sun reached its highest point in the wide, pale sky above the field, Thomas stopped. He stood straight. He rolled his shoulders slowly. He pressed one hand to the small of his back and breathed out long and steady.
Then he walked to the edge of the field, where a low, spreading oak tree stood just beyond the wooden fence, its wide canopy of dark green leaves offering a generous circle of cool shade on the warm grass below. He sat down beneath it slowly, his back against the rough bark of the trunk, his legs stretched out in front of him on the soft grass, his tool resting on the ground beside him. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. The shade was cool and gentle. The breeze moved through the leaves above him with a soft, continuous sound, a slow, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from the tree itself, as if the oak were simply exhaling the morning very slowly and without any particular hurry. The grass beneath him was warm from the morning sun and cool just underneath, the way grass always is in that perfect midday hour. It pressed against his palms softly as he rested his hands on either side of him. He could hear the field around him. Not silence exactly, but the particular kind of fullness that feels like silence. The distant movement of other villagers working in their strips, the soft sound of a cart moving along the path at the far edge, the low murmur of the stream beyond the tree line, the steady, gentle hum of insects moving through the warm air just above the grass. All of it together made a sound that was so familiar and so complete that it became something Thomas stopped hearing with his ears and simply began to feel in his chest. Steady, warm, continuous, like the breathing of something very large and very calm that had been alive for much longer than any person in the village and would continue long after all of them were gone. Mara appeared at the edge of the field some time later. She walked along the path with a calm, easy stride, carrying a small cloth bundle in one hand and a stoppered clay jar in the other. She found Thomas beneath the oak without difficulty. She always knew where to find him, and she sat down beside him in the shade without a word. She opened the cloth bundle. Inside was bread, dark and dense, and still faintly warm from the morning fire, a small wedge of pale cheese, a handful of dried fruit, soft and sweet. She laid it all out between them on the cloth with quiet, careful hands. She unstoppered the jar. Water, cool and clean, with a faint taste of the stone vessel it had rested in overnight. They ate together slowly, without talking very much, just the two of them, beneath the oak, in the middle of the warm, wide day, the field stretching away in all directions around them, green and dark and full of quiet growing things. This was the rest that the morning had earned. Simple, complete, enough. And then Thomas looked up. Through the gap in the oak leaves above him, he could see a small piece of the sky, pale blue, perfectly still. But at the very edge of that small blue window through the leaves, a thin line of dark cloud was beginning to appear on the far horizon, moving slowly, but moving. Stay with us, because the afternoon in this quiet village is about to shift in the way that all gentle days sometimes do. Not suddenly, not loudly, but with that slow, soft certainty of something that has already decided what it is going to do. The village gathers, and a conversation beneath the gray afternoon sky carries something inside it that Thomas has been quietly waiting to hear all morning without knowing it. Keep listening. The oak leaves are still, and the story is resting with you.
The rest beneath the oak did not last forever. Nothing does. But it lasted long enough. Long enough for Thomas to feel the warmth of the earth beneath him settle into his tired back. Long enough for the bread and cheese and cool water to become part of him in that quiet, simple way that food becomes part of you when you eat it slowly and with attention. Long enough for his breathing to slow down, to match the breathing of the tree above him and the field around him and the whole wide, unhurried afternoon. Mara gathered the cloth and the empty jar without rushing. She folded things neatly. She stood slowly. She looked at Thomas for a moment with her calm, steady eyes. "The clouds are moving this way," she said simply. Thomas looked up through the oak leaves again. The thin, dark line on the far horizon had grown. It was still distant, still moving slowly, but it was larger now than it had been before. A long, low band of gray spreading quietly across the pale sky, like ink moving through still water. He nodded. Mara walked back along the field path toward the village with her easy, familiar stride. Thomas watched her go for a moment. Then he picked up his tool from the grass beside him, got to his feet with the slow effort of a man whose body has already done a full morning of work, and turned back toward the field. The afternoon had begun. The quality of the light had changed while he rested. The sharp, shimmering brightness of late morning had softened into something gentler and more diffuse. The sun was still there, still warm on the back of his neck as he bent to his work, but it was filtered now through a thin layer of high cloud that had crept across the sky so quietly that Thomas had not noticed it happening. Everything looked slightly softer. The shadows of the fence posts lay longer across the path. The green of the young plants in the furrows looked deeper, and the dark soil between the rows held a kind of gentle richness in this light that it did not quite have in the sharp brightness of morning. Thomas moved back into his strip of field and began again. The rhythm of the work came back to him quickly, the way familiar things always do. His hands knew what to do. His body knew the right angle for the tool, the right amount of pressure, the right pace for moving along the row without tiring too quickly in the warm afternoon air. He worked steadily, not fast, not slow, just the right pace for a long afternoon, with more hours still ahead of it. Further along the field, he could see others returning to work as well. Old William was still at the far end of his strip, moving with that same patient, unhurried rhythm that seemed as natural to him as breathing. Two younger men from the other side of the village,
brothers, both broad-shouldered and quiet, were working a wide strip of land together, their movements almost perfectly matched, like two parts of the same slow machine. A woman named Rose was working the narrow strip beside Thomas's own. She was perhaps 40 years old, with strong, capable hands and a way of moving through her work that made it look almost effortless. She had a young girl with her, her daughter, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, who was not quite working yet, but was moving alongside her mother through the furrows with the serious, concentrated expression of someone who is learning something important without being taught it directly. Thomas watched the girl for a moment. She was picking up small stones from between the rows and placing them carefully in a pile at the edge of the field, each stone chosen with great attention, each one placed with care. It was such a small thing, and it was so entirely necessary.
Thomas smiled quietly to himself and turned back to his own work. The afternoon moved the way good work moves, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a kind of full, steady progress that you only notice when you stop and look back at where you began and see how much ground you have covered without ever feeling as though you were hurrying. The rows behind Thomas grew longer. The soil he had turned was darker and richer looking than the untouched earth ahead of him. His shoulders ached pleasantly, the comfortable ache of muscles doing what they were made to do, nothing more and nothing less. The breeze moved across the field in long, gentle waves, bending the tops of the young plants slightly and then releasing them. The sound it made moving through the grass at the field's edge was soft and continuous, a low, peaceful rushing that came and went in slow rhythm, like the breathing of something very large and very calm. Thomas breathed with it, in and out, step and step, tool into earth, and lift and move. The afternoon gathered itself around all of them. Thomas, William, Rose, the quiet brothers, the little girl with her careful stones, and held them all in its warm, gray-edged light, like something being kept safe inside cupped hands. It was Rose who spoke first. She called across the narrow gap between their strips without looking up from her work. Her voice was low and unhurried, carrying just far enough to reach Thomas without disturbing the rest of the afternoon. "Edmund came by this morning, I think before you were up," she said. Thomas kept working. He turned his head slightly toward her. "What did he want?" he asked. Rose paused for just a moment before answering. "He said he found something near the mill last night, in the water. He would not say what exactly, only that he wanted to speak to a few people in the village about it before the day was done." She went back to her work. The girl continued placing her careful stones at the edge of the field. The breeze moved through again, slow and cool. Thomas stood still for just a moment, his tool resting in the earth, looking at nothing in particular across the wide afternoon field. Edmund, the mill, something in the water. He thought about the old man's door, already open before the sun had properly risen. The thin line of warm firelight inside, the sound of something being poured from one vessel into another in the quiet of early morning.
Edmund had been awake long before any of them, and now he wanted to talk. Stay with us, because when Edmund, the oldest man in the village, the man who knows every stone and every season of this place, says he found something near the mill and will not say what it is until evening, the afternoon stops feeling quite as ordinary as it did before. The village comes together as the gray clouds finally arrive, and Edmund tells his story beside the fire, and the village listens in the way that small, quiet places listen, completely and all at once. Keep listening. The afternoon is softening, and the story is almost ready to speak its heart.
Thomas finished his row slowly. He straightened up, pressed one hand to the back of his neck, and looked out across the field. The gray clouds that had been building on the horizon all through the afternoon had moved closer now. They were still soft at their edges, not the hard, dark gray of a serious storm, but the gentle, drifting gray of an afternoon that had simply decided to pull a light blanket across itself and rest a little. The air had changed with them, cooler now, a little softer, the kind of air that makes sounds travel differently, closer somehow, more present, as if the world had quietly moved a few steps nearer to itself. Thomas set his tool across his shoulder and walked slowly back toward the village. He was not the only one. All along the field, others were finishing their afternoon work and beginning the gentle drift back toward home. Not all at once, not in any organized way, just a slow, natural gathering of people and tools and tired bodies, all moving in the same direction at the same unhurried pace. The village path received them all quietly. The first person Thomas passed on his way back was a man named Peter. Peter was perhaps 45 years old, though he looked older in the particular way that very cheerful people sometimes do, as if all those years of smiling had pressed themselves permanently into the lines of his face and made themselves comfortable there. He was short and broad, with thick forearms, and a habit of carrying his tools loosely over one shoulder, as if they weighed almost nothing at all. He was standing at the edge of the path, near his own gate, looking up at the clouds with an expression of mild and entirely peaceful interest, the way a person looks at clouds when they have no strong feelings about rain one way or another, and are simply observing what the sky had decided to do. He noticed Thomas coming and raised one hand in a slow, easy greeting. "Looks like she might give us something this evening," Peter said, tilting his head toward the clouds. Thomas looked up with him. "Might," Thomas agreed. They stood together for a moment, both looking at the sky with the same calm, unhurried attention. Two men who had both spent their whole lives reading the weather the way other people read faces, looking for small signs, learning what they meant, and then simply continuing on with whatever needed to be done next. "Good day in the field, though," Peter said after a moment. "Good enough," Thomas said. And that was the whole conversation. But it was enough. It was exactly enough. Because sometimes in a small village, two men standing together looking at the same sky and agreeing that the day was good enough is as complete and satisfying as any longer exchange of words could ever be. Thomas moved on. Further along the path, he passed the home of a woman named Clara.
Clara was perhaps 35, with quick, dark eyes and a calm, practical manner that made people feel immediately settled in her presence. She was standing in the small garden at the front of her home, moving between her herb beds with careful attention, checking each plant with the focused gentleness of someone who takes the small things seriously, because she understands that the small things are where everything important actually lives. She grew the herbs that most of the village used for cooking and for simple remedies: lavender and rosemary along the front edge, thyme and sage in the middle rows, and at the very back, close to the wall of the house where the shelter was greatest, a few plants whose names Thomas did not know, but whose smell, warm and faintly sweet, drifted across the path as he walked by and settled around him like something comfortable being placed on tired shoulders. Clara looked up as he passed. She smiled, brief and genuine and entirely without effort. Thomas smiled back. No words passed between them. None were needed. Near the center of the village, at the open space around the well, a small group of people had gathered. Not a crowd, just 4 or 5 people standing loosely together in the cooling afternoon air, talking in low voices with the unhurried ease of people who have known each other so long that conversation between them no longer requires any particular preparation or effort. Thomas recognized them all immediately. There was Margaret, a tall, thin woman with silver-streaked hair and a deeply calm face, who had lived in the house nearest the well for as long as Thomas could remember. There was her neighbor, a quiet young man named Daniel, who rarely spoke much, but always seemed to be listening with more attention than most people give to anything. There was Rose, who had already come back from the field and was standing with her arms folded lightly across her chest, her young daughter pressed against her side. And there was Agnes, standing a little apart from the others, her dark shawl pulled close, her eyes soft and distant. Thomas slowed as he approached. He was not sure what had drawn them all together at the well at this particular moment in the afternoon, but there was something in the way they were standing, something in the gentle, collected stillness of them, that made him feel as if he had arrived at the end of a long sentence rather than the beginning of one. Margaret looked at him as he stopped. "Edmund sent word," she said quietly. "He is asking people to come to his home this evening before the light goes." Thomas looked around the small group. All of their faces held the same expression.
Not to worry exactly, not excitement. Something quieter than either of those things. Something closer to the feeling you get when you know that something has shifted somewhere nearby, and you are still waiting to understand what it means. "Did anyone speak with him directly?" Thomas asked. Agnes looked up then. Her dark, gentle eyes found Thomas across the small, quiet space between them. "I did," she said softly. She paused. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. "He found something in the mill stream last night, an old stone, carved. He does not know what it says, but the marks on it are older than anything he has seen in his long life in this village." The group was very quiet. The well stood in the center of them all, dark and mossy and completely still. The gray clouds above the village had moved closer still. The light around them all had softened to that particular gentle dimness that comes just before an evening rain, everything slightly muted, slightly hushed, as if the world itself were leaning in to listen. Thomas looked at the faces around him, and then he looked toward Edmund's home.
The door was closed now, but the faint orange glow of firelight showed through the small window. Edmund was inside, waiting, and whatever that carved stone meant, whatever those old marks said that Edmund could not read, it had kept the oldest man in the village awake since before the sun had risen. Stay with us, because this evening gathering around Edmund's fire is about to become the most important hour of this quiet, ordinary day. A carved stone pooled from a mill stream, marks older than memory, and a village sitting together in the firelight, trying to understand what the earth has kept hidden beneath their feet all this time. The fire is lit, Edmund speaks, and the story that comes out of that small, warm room changes the way every person in it sees the ground they have walked on their entire lives. Keep listening. The evening is coming gently, and the deepest part of the story is almost here. The clouds parted, just for a little while, just long enough for the late afternoon sun to find the gap between the gray and push through it. And when it did, the light that came out was something different from anything the day had offered before. It was golden, deeply, warmly, completely golden. The kind of light that only comes in that particular window of late afternoon, when the sun has traveled most of the way across the sky and the angle of it has changed everything. It did not shine down from above the way morning light does. It came in from the side, low and reaching, touching everything it found at a long, gentle angle and turning it into something richer and softer and more beautiful than it had looked all day. The thatched roofs of the village glowed. The pale mud walls caught the light and held it like something warm pressed against them from the outside. The narrow dirt paths between the homes turned the color of old honey. The wooden fences and gateposts threw long, thin shadows across the ground that stretched and stretched until they disappeared into the soft grass at the field's edge. Even the stones of the old well at the center of the village, dark and cool and moss-covered, caught a little of that light on their upper edges and held it there, glowing faintly like embers. Thomas stood in the middle of the village path and looked at all of it. He did not move for a long moment. He simply looked. This was the hour he loved most. He could not have explained why exactly if someone had asked him. He did not have the words for it, not because he was not thoughtful, but because some things in a life do not fit neatly into words and were never meant to. They are meant to be felt, meant to be stood inside of, meant to be breathed in slowly while you are standing on a familiar path in a small village at the end of a long, good day. The golden hour, that is what it was. Every day it came and every day it went, lasting only as long as it lasted, which was never quite long enough and always exactly right. Thomas walked slowly through it. He moved along the path toward Edmund's home, but without rushing. The evening gathering could wait a few more minutes. The light could not. He passed Peter's gate again. Peter was no longer standing there, gone inside most likely to wash the day from his hands and sit by his fire. But the low stone wall beside Peter's gate caught the golden light along its top edge and held it in a long, warm line that Thomas ran his hand along as he passed, feeling the sun-warmed stone beneath his rough fingers. He passed Clara's garden. The herbs in their careful rows were transformed in this light. The lavender at the front edge had turned a deeper, richer purple. The rosemary lifted its small pale flowers toward the low golden sun with quiet, patient attention. The whole garden smelled different in the evening air, warmer, fuller, as if the day's heat had finally released everything the plants had been holding inside themselves and sent it all drifting gently outward into the cool that was beginning to gather at the edges of the warmth. Thomas breathed it in slowly. Lavender, rosemary, earth, the faint sweetness of something he still could not name. He let it fill him completely. Near the edge of the village, where the path curved toward the mill stream, he paused again. The stream was beautiful in this light. It moved between its low banks with a quiet, rhythmic sound, a soft and continuous voice that had been speaking in exactly this way for longer than anyone alive could remember. The water caught the golden afternoon light and broke it into 1,000 small shimmering pieces that moved and shifted and disappeared and reappeared with every gentle ripple. Thomas stood at the edge of the bank and watched the water for a while. He thought about Edmund. He thought about the stone that the old man had found here in this very stream last night, in the dark, before anyone else was awake, before the first pale edge of gray had appeared on the horizon. He tried to imagine Edmund standing here in the darkness, reaching into the cold water, feeling the shape of something beneath his fingers that did not feel like an ordinary stone. What had Edmund felt in that moment? Surprise, perhaps? Or perhaps not exactly surprise, perhaps something closer to recognition, the feeling of touching something very old and understanding without knowing why that it matters, that it has always mattered, that it has been waiting here, in this water, patient and still and perfectly quiet, for exactly the right pair of hands to find it. The stream moved on, indifferent and beautiful, carrying its light and its sound downstream and away. Thomas turned and walked toward Edmund's home. The door was still closed, but there were more people gathered outside it now, soft shapes in the golden light, standing loosely together in the way people stand when they have come somewhere with purpose, but are in no particular hurry to begin. Margaret was there, Daniel, Rose with her daughter now asleep against her shoulder, the child's face completely peaceful, one small hand curled loosely at her chin. Agnes and William stood together just to one side. William's broad hand rested on Agnes's shoulder, not protectively, not anxiously, just resting there, the way a hand rests on a shoulder when two people have stood beside each other in every kind of moment for 40 years and no longer need to think about it. Thomas joined them quietly. No one spoke very much.
The golden light moved slowly across them all, unhurried and warm, touching each face with the same gentle attention it gave to the thatched roofs and the stone walls and the surface of the mill stream. And then the door opened. Edmund stood in the doorway. He was smaller than Thomas always remembered him being, a little thinner, a little more stooped at the shoulders, but his eyes were the same as they had always been, dark and clear, and full of a quietness that went down a long way. He looked at the small group gathered outside his home. He looked at each face slowly. "Come in," he said. His voice was low and calm. "Come in and sit. I have something to show you." He stepped back from the doorway, and the warm firelight from inside reached out across the threshold and lay itself down on the path like a welcome. Thomas was the last through the door. He paused for just a moment on the threshold. Behind him,
The golden light of the late afternoon was beginning to soften and fade at its edges. The gray clouds were moving back in slowly. The day was letting go of its warmth in the quiet, gradual way that all good days eventually do. He looked back at it one more time. The village in that fading golden light, the fields beyond, the stream, the oak tree at the edge of everything, its wide canopy of leaves catching the last of the day's color and holding it for one more long, peaceful moment. Then Thomas stepped inside. The door closed softly behind him, and Edmund, standing beside his fire with a small dark stone cradled in both hands, began to speak. "Stay with us, because what Edmund holds in his hands is older than this village, older than anyone sitting in that warm, fire-lit room. And the story he tells next, quietly, slowly, beside that gentle fire, is the story that this whole ordinary day has been quietly building toward since before the sun even rose. Edmund speaks, and the village listens, and something that has been sleeping beneath this land for a very long time begins very gently to wake. Keep listening. The fire is warm, the room is still, and the best part of the story is just beginning."
The room was small, smaller than it looked from outside somehow. The low ceiling beams were dark with years of smoke. The walls were close and warm. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth by decades of the same feet moving across it in the same familiar patterns, from the door to the fire, from the fire to the table, from the table to the small wooden chair near the window where Edmund spent his long evenings. A single fire burned in the stone hearth. Not large, not dramatic, just a steady, gentle fire, the kind that has been carefully tended for many hours and has settled into itself completely, burning with a low, rhythmic breathing of orange and gold that filled the whole room with a warmth that went deeper than just temperature. It was the kind of warmth that reaches something inside you, the kind that makes your shoulders drop without you deciding to let them, the kind that makes your breathing slow down before you even notice it happening. They arranged themselves around the room slowly and without fuss. Margaret sat on the low wooden bench near the far wall, her long hands folded quietly in her lap. Daniel settled onto the floor near the door, his back against the wall, his knees drawn up loosely. Rose sat in the chair nearest the fire, her sleeping daughter still resting against her shoulder, the child's face completely soft and open in the firelight. Agnes and William took the bench closest to Edmund's chair, close enough to hear every word clearly, close enough to reach out and touch his arm if they needed to. Thomas sat on the floor near the hearth. He pulled his knees up slowly and rested his forearms across them and looked at the fire. The flames moved in long, gentle shapes, rising and falling, bending slightly when the draft moved through the room, casting soft, shifting light across every face in the room, light that moved and breathed and made everyone look a little younger and a little more peaceful than they perhaps felt on the inside. Nobody spoke. They simply settled. The way people settle when they have come to a place that feels safe and they have no reason to hurry, and the weight of the day is still on them, but it is a good weight, the weight of work done and food eaten and the familiar company of known faces. Edmund stood beside the fire for a moment longer. Then he sat down in his old wooden chair slowly, the way a man sits who has learned that the chair will still be there whether he hurries or not.
He placed both hands on his knees. He looked at the faces around him, one by one.
And then he reached beside his chair and lifted the stone. It was not large, perhaps the length of a hand, flat on one side, rounded on the other, the way river stones always are, shaped over long years by the quiet, patient work of moving water. Its color was dark, almost black when it was wet, Edmund said. But now, dry and warm in the firelight, it was a deep gray-brown with a surface that caught the light in a particular way, not shining exactly, but glowing faintly, as if something inside the stone itself were very slowly, very gently breathing. And on the flat side, marks, carved into the stone with something sharp and deliberate, not scratched carelessly, not accidental. Each mark was made with intention, pressed into the surface with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had taken their time doing it. Lines, curves, shapes that were almost like letters, but not quite like any letters anyone in the room had ever seen. Edmund held the stone, flat in both palms, and turned it slowly toward the firelight so everyone could see. The room was very quiet. Rose's daughter shifted slightly in her sleep. The fire crackled once softly. The wind moved against the outside of the small window and then passed on. "I found it just after dark last night," Edmund said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man telling something true. The water was running lower than usual near the mill wheel. I went to check the channel. I do that sometimes when the wheel sounds different, and there it was, sitting in the shallow water near the edge, half buried in the mud at the bottom, the top of it just showing above the surface. He paused. He looked at the stone in his hands. "I reached down and picked it up," he said, "and I stood there in the dark, holding it for a long time. I do not know exactly how long. The water was cold around my feet, but I did not move." He looked up at them. "Something about it," he said quietly. "Something about holding it. It felt like—" He paused, searching for the right word. "It felt like finding a letter that someone wrote a very long time ago and never sent. Like touching something that was always meant to be found, just not yet, just not until now." The fire moved gently in the hearth. Thomas looked at the marks on the stone from where he sat. He could not read them. Nobody in the room could read them, but looking at them, at the careful, deliberate way each mark had been placed, at the patience that somehow was still visible in the stone after all the long years it had spent beneath the water, he felt something that he could not quite name. Not worry, not fear. Something quieter than either of those things. Something closer to the feeling you get when you realize that the place you have lived your whole life past, and it is quiet, and it has been waiting with the same patient stillness as the stone itself. Agnes spoke first. Her voice was soft. "Who made it?" she asked. "Who carved it?" Edmund shook his head slowly. "I do not know," he said. "I have never seen marks like these, not in all my years." He looked at the stone again. "But they knew what they were doing," he said, "whoever they were. They knew exactly what they were saying. We are the ones who do not know how to listen." The room held his words for a long moment. The fire breathed. Outside, the first gentle rain of the evening began to fall, soft and steady against the thatched roof above them. A quiet, rhythmic sound, comfortable and clean.
the sound of the world outside doing what it does, while the people inside sit warm and close and still. Thomas listened to the rain. He looked at the stone in Edmund's hands. He thought about the mill stream, about the long, patient years the stone had spent beneath the water, about all the mornings this village had existed above it, all the doors opening, all the fires lit, all the feet on the familiar paths, while the stone lay quiet and hidden and perfectly still in the dark water below, waiting, just waiting. Stay with us, because this room, this small, warm room full of familiar faces and firelight and the sound of gentle rain on the roof, is where this whole long day has been slowly, quietly leading. The final part of our story. Edmund says one more thing beside that fire, something that settles over the whole room like the warmth itself, something that each person carries home with them through the soft evening rain, something that makes this ordinary day feel like it was never quite as ordinary as it seemed. Keep listening. The fire is low and warm, the rain is gentle on the roof, and the end of the story is as peaceful as the beginning.
Edmund said one more thing. He said it quietly, without drama, without ceremony, just a simple thing, spoken in a low voice beside a gentle fire while the rain continued its soft, steady conversation with the thatched roof above them all. He said, "Whatever this stone is, whatever it means, whatever the people who made it were trying to say to the world, they were here, right here, on this same ground, breathing the same air, looking at the same sky." He paused. "And they wanted to be remembered," he said. "That is what this is. Someone pressing their hand into the world and saying, 'I was here. This mattered. Do not forget.'" He looked down at the stone in his hands one more time, and then he set it carefully on the low table beside his chair, and he folded his hands in his lap, and he said nothing more. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Not an uncomfortable quiet, not the quiet of people who do not know what to say, but the deep, full quiet of people who have been given something to carry and are simply sitting with the weight of it for a moment before standing up and taking it home. The fire breathed slowly in the hearth. Rose's daughter slept on, completely undisturbed, her small face soft and open in the firelight. One tiny hand had found its way to the fabric of her mother's sleeve and was holding it loosely, not gripping, just resting there, the way small hands rest on things they trust completely. Thomas looked at that small hand for a long moment. He thought about the stone. He thought about the person who had made it, whoever they were, however long ago, in whatever kind of morning or evening they had chosen to press those careful marks into the flat gray surface. Had they stood in a field like his? Had they walked a path like the one outside? Had they watched the same mill stream catch the same light? Had they felt, at the end of a long day, the same particular tiredness in their hands and the same quiet satisfaction in their chest? He thought they probably had. He thought most of it was probably not so different. People began to leave slowly. Not all at once, not with any formality, just one by one, the way people leave a warm room when the evening has been good and full and the time has simply come to go home. Daniel went first. He stood quietly, nodded to Edmund, and slipped out through the door into the soft rain without a word. Margaret went next,
pulling her shawl up over her hair against the rain and pausing in the doorway to look back at Edmund with a long, warm look that said everything her words did not need to say. Rose lifted her sleeping daughter carefully from her shoulder and settled the child against her chest, the girl's head lolling softly against her mother's neck without waking. She carried her out into the rain with the practiced ease of a woman who has carried sleeping children through many dark evenings. Agnes and William were the last to go, after Thomas. Agnes paused at the door and turned back to Edmund. She looked at the stone on the table.
"It belongs here," she said softly. "In the village, not back in the water." Edmund nodded slowly. "I think so too," he said. Agnes smiled at him. Then she and William stepped out into the dark evening together, William's hand finding Agnes's arm in the natural, unhurried way it always did, and the two of them walked away along the wet path toward home. Thomas was the last to leave. He stood at the door for a moment and looked back at Edmund. The old man was still sitting in his chair beside the fire. The stone was on the table beside him. His hands were folded in his lap. His eyes were on the flames. He looked very peaceful. He looked like a man who has carried something for a long time and has finally found the right place to set it down. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. Edmund looked up. He nodded once. "Go home, Thomas," he said gently. "Go home and sleep well." Thomas stepped out into the evening. The rain was soft and steady, not cold, not heavy, just a gentle, continuous falling of water from a dark and quiet sky. The kind of rain that does not demand anything from you, the kind you can simply walk through slowly without minding it at all. The village path was dark, but familiar. Every stone beneath his feet, every curve of the path, every low fence and garden wall and gap between homes. He did not need to see them clearly. He simply walked, and his feet knew the way completely, the way they always had, the way they always would. The village around him was settling in to sleep. One by one, the small windows that had shown warm light were going dark. The fires inside the homes were being banked low for the night, just enough ember left to start the morning fire without trouble. The animals in their barns were still and quiet. The fields beyond the fences lay dark and wide and breathing under the soft rain. Everything was putting itself to rest, slowly, gently, without resistance. The way things rest when the day has been full and good and there is nothing left undone that needed doing. Thomas opened his own door quietly. The house was warm inside. Mara had kept the fire going, a low, gentle glow in the hearth that filled the room with soft amber light and the comfortable smell of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Mara was already in bed, not asleep, just lying quietly in the warm dark, her breathing slow and even. Thomas pulled off his wet coat. He set his boots near the door. He moved to the hearth and held his hands toward the warmth for a moment, feeling the cold of the rain leave his fingers slowly. He looked around the small room. The low ceiling, the dark beams, the familiar shapes of everything in its familiar places. The rough wooden table. The bowls were stacked near the fire. The two children asleep near the far wall, curled together under their blanket like two warm stones, their breathing soft and completely steady. He stood there for a long, quiet moment, just standing in his own home, just looking at the things he loved, just breathing. He thought about the stone, about the hands that made it, about Edmund's words beside the fire,
about all the long, quiet years between whoever pressed those marks into the gray surface and this particular evening. All the mornings and fields and fires and sleeping children in between. All the simple days, all the good work, all the bread and the rain and the golden afternoon light and the mill stream catching the first sun of the morning. All of it, still here, all of it still quietly continuing, as it had always continued, as it would continue long after this small village and everyone in it had become their own kind of stone, pressed gently into the earth, patient and still, waiting for the right hands to find them. Thomas moved to the bed slowly. He lay down beside Mara. The warmth of the blanket settled over him like something welcoming him home. He closed his eyes. Outside, the rain continued its soft and steady falling on the thatched roof above him, a gentle, rhythmic sound, continuous and complete, like the breathing of something very large and very calm that had been here long before any of them and would remain long after. The fire in the hearth crackled once, very softly, and then the village was quiet, completely, perfectly, beautifully quiet. The kind of quiet that is not empty, the kind that is full, full of everything the day was, full of the morning light and the open field and the oak tree's shade and Edmund's fire and the stone and the rain, full of familiar faces and rough hands and the smell of bread warming and the sound of a stream running over ancient things in the dark, full of all of it, held gently, held safely, resting now, just resting. Thank you for spending this day with us, this quiet, ordinary, beautiful day in a small medieval village that never had a grand name, a day that belonged to Thomas and Mara and Edmund and Agnes and William and Rose and all the others who simply lived, simply, fully, completely, on this small piece of earth beneath this wide and patient sky. If this story brought you peace tonight, if it slowed your breathing and softened the edges of your day, then it did exactly what it came to do. Rest now. The village is sleeping. The fire is low. The rain is gentle on the roof. And tomorrow, the first light will come again before sunrise, just as it always has, just as it always will.
And so the village sleeps, just as you may be sleeping now, too. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for slowing down, for letting this quiet little world carry you somewhere peaceful. In a day that moves so fast, choosing stillness is something special, and you did that tonight. If this story brought you even a few minutes of calm, of rest, of that gentle feeling of drifting somewhere soft and far away, then please take just one small moment before you close your eyes. Hit the like button. It truly helps this channel reach more people who need a little quiet in their lives. Leave a comment and tell us, did you fall asleep before part 10, or did you make it all the way to the end? We always love hearing from you. Share this video with someone who needs a good night's rest tonight. You might just give them the best gift they receive all week. And if you have not already,
subscribe to Sleeptale Histories. Every week, we bring you slow, peaceful, deeply atmospheric history stories designed to calm your mind, rest your body, and carry you gently into sleep. Medieval villages, ancient worlds, quiet lives lived simply and fully, all told in the same soft, unhurried voice you heard tonight. This is your calm place. This is your quiet corner of the internet. And we will always be here whenever the world gets too loud and you need somewhere gentle to come back to. More stories are waiting for you right here on this channel. Each one is slower, each one warmer, each one made with care, just for you. So rest now. You are safe here. Good night from Sleeptale Histories. We will see you in the next one.